Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. It's 2021. Can you believe it? We're here and we're back together again. It's so exciting to have you here today. We've got a fun show today. It may be a little bit of a shorter show as we go into 2021. First of all, we're going to have the COVID Connect news. We're going to go a little more in depth in that than we have in previous shows. Also, because we've been apart for 2 or 3 weeks now. There's some things that have happened, and we wanted to start to touch on the vaccine information that is coming out. So we're looking forward to hearing about that. After that, based on some conversations we've had, we thought it would be appropriate to do some FDA education. And this title may not sound like much of a thriller, but it's checklists or processes, because we're seeing that companies are mistaking something when it comes to implementing the transition from emergency use authorizations to traditional 510Ks. So we're going to talk to you about that today. Then our big announcement for 2021 coming up in the third slot. And after that, Q&A. As always, we're always happy to have questions that you may have, comments about things that have been on previous shows, as well as any check-ins. If you're a community member and you're doing something cool for the MedTech community, we always want to hear from you. So please don't be shy. At the end of the show, if there's something you want to tell us, what your company is doing, what you're doing, an event that's coming up. We would love to hear about it. So without further ado, we're going to go on to COVID Connect here, to the COVID news. And as we always do, we're going to start with the COVID metrics from covidtracking.com. And if you're a longtime listener of the show, you know that we tend to focus on hospitalizations because cases can have all sorts of caveats put along with it, and deaths can have all sorts of caveats put along with it. But the hospitalizations have been one of the best metrics all along to look at. And with that, here is the US currently hospitalized. If you recall, in the spring and summer, we were watching that wave that passed in two peaks across the US. The first one in the Northeast, and then the second one in the South. And of course, where we are now has dwarfed both of those, and it continues to rise. But looking at that graph for so many weeks in a row, I started to ask myself, how does this compare in relation to what the country actually has in terms of hospital beds? I wasn't aware of how many hospital beds were in the US. And so from the American Hospital Association, this number, that there are a total of 924,000 staffed hospital beds in the US. And so what we're looking at in terms of people with COVID, again, there's the whole question of with COVID or from COVID, but leaving that aside, we're at about 1/9, a little more than 1/9 of the hospital bed population in the US with COVID. And of course, as you know, that tends to be focused in certain areas, certain regions. And so that's why you hear about challenges to hospital bed capacity, like we've been hearing about recently in California. And so that is the total staffed number of hospital beds. Also, this graphic from the COVID tracking project, which has been just an absolute stalwart throughout all of this. If you look regionally, you can see that the Northeast, after a long time of not seeing much, has picked up again. And California, which had seemed to have things under control most of the way through, now a hotbed. Although, to be fair, if we look at the number of cases per million, the number of hospitalizations per million residents, it evens out a little bit more. California and Nevada are still up there, as is New Mexico, and some in the South and East. But this gives you maybe a better picture per million residents, and the weighting by that. If we look at the regions themselves, you can also see that the Northeast continues to climb. The South is climbing like never before, the West like never before. And in fact, the Midwest appears to be at the moment on its way down. So good news for those of us here in the Midwestern states. But the Northeast, which we thought for months and months and months was never going to come back up, is definitely heading back up. Maybe nearing a peak, but hard to say at this point. Also wanted to catch you up on this graphic, also from covidtracking.com. Back on December 18th, the last show that we had together, it looked like some good news. Cases were rising in only 10 states, staying the same in 25 and falling in 21. But now they are rising in most states, 44 states, staying the same in 10 and falling in just 2. So that's a disappointing news. If you come to Michigan, where we are, the hospitalizations follow the regional trend, and in fact seem to be surpassing the regional trend. That they're really dropping off, which is a great thing to see. It's encouraging to see that maybe the 7-day death trends have never surpassed what happened in the spring, but have many times talked about our frontline workers here and how they've learned to triage. We had at the end of last year, we had Dr. Philip Levy from Wayne State on, who really told us a lot about how they are treating really effects that are gonna take you down. They're not treating symptoms anymore, so they're most likely to send you home if it's just a symptom that's going to go away, like loss of taste or smell or just a fever. And yet, learning how to treat the things that are most likely to really damage long-term health. And so I think that's behind a lot. So we just, once again, whenever we show these numbers, I just want to say thank you to our hospital staff and researchers who have figured this thing out on their feet. They've had to encounter it. I remember somebody said, "Oh, we used to look at pulse ox and we used to ventilate immediately if your pulse ox dropped too far." Turns out that that's not the best way to treat COVID, and so you're seeing this kind of learning along the way. So we really tip our hat to our healthcare workers, and those are the numbers for COVID. I wanted to look with you though, as everyone is thinking about vaccine distribution. Again, from Dr. Levy when he was on the show, mentioned that a vaccine can only be really ever as good as getting a disease. And so we don't want to overweight the enthusiasm that we put behind the vaccine. Nevertheless, it's going to increase, we think, the B cell and T cell responses, and it should be a good thing. And so we'd like to track, now that we're doing the COVID tracking, we'd also like to track what's happening with the vaccines. And this last week is the first time that I really dug into what's happening with the vaccines. All this from cdc.gov. Of course, you know, probably no matter what state you're in, that it's really up to the states how they're going to distribute the vaccines. And so some of those distribution questions come down to the state level. But CDC has put out this helpful webpage that talks about the 2 current vaccines, the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, and about their distribution. And we can learn a few interesting things from it. So I wanted to take you through this for just a minute. The first is a PDF on that website that just gives us a little bit of a flow of the logistics of how they're distributing the vaccines. Obviously, Pfizer and Moderna, the 2 makers of the vaccines, they're bottling them up there. The Moderna vaccine goes to what's called a kitting facility. And then there's 2 pathways that they can get to the shipping companies. Pfizer transports via UPS and FedEx. I don't know if it's just an oversight, but it appears that these are not going through USPS. And of course, that would be because in the case of the Pfizer vaccine, these things are stored at, I believe, -80, and they actually have to deliver dry ice recharge kits to keep the temperature down on these as they get them to their destinations. So these are how the vaccines are getting to hospital systems and other locations. Let's talk about allocations for a minute. So Pfizer, their allocations are being tracked on this CDC website. And what we see is the current allocations. They're only currently allocated through January 10th, although we'll talk about that more in a minute. And what you'll see is that Pfizer has been delivering approximately 2 to 3 million doses per week. You'll notice that there's a first dose and then a second dose. Both vaccines require 2 doses. And they've been doing between 2 and 3 million doses per week, split up among the states. If you're interested, you can go to this website and you can look and see which state has gotten how many doses of vaccine allocated for it. The numbers are similar for Moderna, where they actually started out with a bang with 5.9 million doses. And then they made their way to 2 million doses per week. And they continue on there. But this left me at least with a question. And that question is nicely answered by this article by Quartz. How many Pfizer and Moderna vaccines did the US buy, and when will they arrive? That's one of the big questions. Some of that we can't answer because it's up to the states and it's up to the distribution systems there. But in the case of the contract that has been made, here's what we're seeing via Quartz, that Pfizer and Moderna, respectively, 25 million and 20 million doses that were due by December 31st. Those are now being allocated on a per week basis. And then Pfizer, another 75 million doses on March 31st, and another 70 million doses on June 30th. And then finally, on July 31st, another 30 million doses. Moderna, 100 million doses by June 30th, for a total of 400 million doses. But remember, that's 2 doses per person. So this should cover 200 million people. There's about 329 million people in the US these days, but that's a significant chunk of the population, those who are willing to take it. Another tidbit out of the Quartz article, including funding for vaccine development, trials, and purchase orders, the government has given each company about $4 billion for COVID-19 vaccines, and additional orders are likely forthcoming. The government's contract with Moderna includes an option for an additional 300 million doses and 400 million for Pfizer. We heard before about AstraZeneca's vaccine, but it sounds like they're not quite through the gate yet. They could order 300 million doses from AstraZeneca, but apparently, according to Quartz, there are some concerns about safety and trial transparency. We haven't followed up on that, but that may explain why we haven't seen an AstraZeneca vaccine yet. So that is the COVID news and the vaccine news. We're glad to be able to track that with you. I do see a hand raised with respect to this. So what we're going to do is we're going to see if we can answer that question here live, because we'll go on to other things in just a minute. So Ken Spencer, you're live with us. It's good to talk to you, my friend, in 2021.
Yes, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
So I don't know if you saw the recent news where the Biden team aims to release all vaccine doses in a break from the policy to hold back the stock for the second shot.
That's interesting. No, we did not see that news. And I guess the question that I don't know if you or I know the answer to is whether the companies are in a position to simply release those, or whether logistically that's not a possibility. But have you heard anything on that, Ken?
I have not, other than they just don't want to hold back the doses, which has been the current policy out there. They're betting on the companies being able to provide the second dose in time.
Yeah, that would be, I mean, it'd be great if they could free up that. Of course, we all know it's a bottleneck question, so it will remain to be seen where the bottlenecks in that distribution are coming. I'd be interested to know that. Yeah, thanks for the question. Appreciate that. We also have a question here. Jeff asks, any good sources for vaccine tracking numbers to watch? Well, your question is mine, Jeff. We started looking for that. It took a number of weeks or months for a source like covidtracking.com to emerge as an unbiased data source that we could just go to and draw our own conclusions. We're still waiting for that for the vaccine tracking, but we'd certainly like to see it. I think what Ken just mentioned is fascinating, and it does then start to get down into you're not tracking really clean numbers. You're tracking numbers that are bundled up in federal, state, and local policies. And it's going to be an interesting search for where the bottlenecks are and how to get those vaccines out there. So great question. We will let you know as soon as we find a source that's on par with covidtracking.com. For now, we're piecing it together as we go along. But glad for the questions. We will do our best to keep bringing you this information as we move forward as a part of our COVID Connect section here on MedTech Crossroads. So with that, I don't see any more hands raised. We will go on to the next segment of our show, also in presentation today, and that is this question. Oh, you know what? We're going to pause because Matt has a question. Does anyone know what the projected immunity rate is after just the first dose? I'm assuming it isn't 95%. We also have a hand raised there. We had a hand raised from Jim Arthurs. Feel free to raise that again, Jim, if you wanted to raise that. Don't know if you had an answer. Matt, we don't know here at Into Being and on MedTech Crossroads. Although your question is a fascinating one, because if it's like other things, like you go out, you get an antibiotic, and what are we always told? Don't stop the course of antibiotics, because that's how we get drug-resistant bacteria and other things. So then the question's going to come, what happens when somebody goes out and gets the first dose and doesn't go back for the second? You know it's going to happen. It happens with antibiotics. It's guaranteed to happen with this. I think it's a fascinating question you've raised there. We don't have an answer today. If anyone does have an answer on the call with the expertise to answer that, we'd be happy to entertain that. Another comment here from Ken Spencer.
Yeah, so Gina, not that I'm an expert on this, but so I've seen the tabs from both Pfizer and Moderna there, and they're north of 50% in terms of efficacy after the first shot. They don't have exact numbers on there yet that I've seen, but they're both north of 50%.
North of 50%. Okay, that's good. Obviously, still the call is, if you're going to start with it, do the second one, because that's how the vaccine is designed to work. Great questions, great comments. I think this will be fascinating to follow in the coming days as we see. And of course, on everybody's mind is also this question of, what about variants with COVID? We know that with the flu, there's multiple vaccines, and they have to combine them to try to get a yearly vaccine that's going to work. And it's not you're vaccinated for it once and you're good forever. We don't know that all yet for COVID. We're still waiting. And so we've heard a number of things. We don't want to cast ideas on one side or the other, but rather we're going to have another data collection and looking at to do as the weeks pass here, just like we did when COVID was first breaking, to look at what's happening with these vaccines. Are they doing what they're supposed to? Are we getting them to where they need to be? And are people getting them when they want to have access to them? So with that, I'll wait 10 seconds for other comments. We had some late breaking ones there. Great feedback, great comments. I'm thankful for each one of you and your thoughts. We want to go into this question. Is medical device development, is it a process or a checklist when it comes to FDA clearance? Now that may seem like a strange question to be asking, maybe even a dry question to be asking. Here's another way to ask it, and then I'm going to tell you why we're asking this question and why we're asking it today. Another way to ask the question is development of a medical device linear or is it recursive? Does it require repetition, or can you just go straight through and be done? Are there best practices? For those of you who've heard the Cynefin talks, you know that there probably aren't best practices for novel medical device development. It's a recursive process. You've heard this before. You've heard that it requires iterations. It requires multiple shots on goal. Why are we asking this now? Why this segment right now? Well, we've been getting a lot of calls at Into Being from folks who are looking to move from an emergency use authorization, frequently for personal protective equipment, to a long-term 510K so that they can keep selling it. Because remember, the emergency use authorizations are time limited. I want a hat tip to our friends up at Michigan State University who got relatively recently a emergency use authorization for a decontamination system for N95s. I didn't actually know this until I was going through the EUA list recently. And I found that they had gotten a nice letter authorizing their emergency use authorization for a mask decontamination system. Good job, guys. Glad to hear it. At the bottom of every emergency use authorization letter, there is this note. This EUA will be effective until the declaration that circumstances exist justifying this authorization terminated under this section. What is that saying? It's saying that somewhere over the horizon, and it keeps getting closer, these EUAs will no longer be valid because the situation that precipitated their need and all the great work that FDA has done will be gone. Well, at that point, all these companies that had invested thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in development are going to be sitting there with stock and nothing that they can do about it. That's why the push to get the 510K, to get these devices cleared under normal pathways. And those questions have been coming our way. And there's a common challenge that happens with all of these. There are some common assumptions that get made, probably in part because the FDA has done a great job of trying to simplify the path for the emergency use authorizations. They did their best to get out of the way. They couldn't entirely remove themselves from it, but they tried to streamline it. They tried to checklist it. They tried to say, give us these things, and if you can give us these things and don't do these things, we'll give you an EUA. And in many cases, that did work quite nicely. So people have gotten used to a checklist kind of mentality. Give me A, B, C, D, and you're on the market. Here's the challenge. That's not how medical devices are cleared under normal circumstances in the United States. There is a push to try to be able to clear devices that are kind of run of the mill that way. But that's not normally how devices are cleared. And so this sets up companies that have EUAs, sadly, for potential failure down the road, because the EUA was relatively easy to get. But now to maintain that device on the market, there's a lot more that needs to be done. Let's take an example here of surgical masks. We all know them and love them at this point. At some point on MedTech Crossroads, we're going to have a runoff for what's everybody's favorite mask. We've all got months and months of wearing them now. We've got the experience. We need to have that contest. But until that happens, here's a tale of 3 roadmaps to a 510K. And hint, only one of them is actually successful. But the default roadmap that a company these days thinks they have, especially if they went through the emergency use authorization process, they think that they need to do biocomp testing, fluid resistance testing, filtration testing, flammability testing, and maybe pressure testing. They need to submit that to the FDA, and they're going to get their 510K. At least that's the impression that many companies have. We've had a lot of conversations where people are saying, oh, I just need to do this testing and I need to submit it to FDA and then I'll have a 510K. Here's the challenge. FDA has issued guidance for surgical masks in particular. So we can now construct an FDA guidance informed roadmap. But this one's not as simple as what most companies have in their head. In their guidance, the FDA says that you have to also submit design requirements for the masks. You have to submit risk analysis for the masks. You have to submit your labeling and intended use for the masks. Do you have to do the testing that we talked about before? Sure do. But you have to then demonstrate that the acceptance criteria were met and that the mitigations for the risks were incorporated. This starts to look a little bit less like a checklist and a little bit more like a process. One where you have to say at the front, here's what we're trying to do, then do it, and then demonstrate that you did it to the satisfaction of all involved. Let's take a look at how this plays out in the real working. We're also going to talk about the FDA expected roadmap. The bad news is that the default company's roadmap isn't the right one. Even one that's been informed by FDA guidance still isn't the right roadmap. The actual roadmap that FDA expects you to follow assumes a few things that most companies haven't heard about. And that's why we're doing this today, as you make that change. If we really simplify it though, here's that process that we should all be thinking about, frankly, anytime we're trying to solve a problem. What are my requirements? What am I actually trying to accomplish? It's not a checklist of do this, and you'll be done. It's what does this need to do? And when we do all those things, that will have become our checklist. So specific to our device, what do we have to do? Then we can do a design for that device. Then we can test it. That's where some of the checklists come back. Then we can draw a conclusion on those results. How did the testing have to change for a particular device? What did we change about the design from a predicate device? That's a frequently overlooked part. 510Ks are not based on direct safety and efficacy. They're based on substantial equivalence to a predicate device. So while you could get your emergency use authorization on the basis of testing alone, you're going to get your 510K on the basis of substantial equivalence to a predicate device. Do you know what predicate device you're selecting? Do you know what its intended use is? Have you ensconced those as requirements? The merging of your device with that device to be able to say, this is equivalent, this is equivalent, this is equivalent, this is equivalent. At the end of this process, you're going to have to come to a conclusion that your device is safe and effective and substantially equivalent to your predicate device. Then and only then are you ready to consider submitting a 510K to the agency. And in fact, even once you're there, you're not done. Change control has to happen ongoing, going forward for a class 2 510K cleared device. And that can take you all the way back to your design requirements. It's this readiness to run a process that is standing between many companies and their long-term success with the FDA. Let's take a look at it from a more traditional perspective. And this is a term that we've said many times on the show, but I'm going to say it again because we're still getting calls from folks saying, oh, I just need to do these things. FDA expects most medical devices to conform with 21 CFR 820. That is the quality system regulation of the US Code of Federal Regulations. And it is what creates this waterfall kind of process, starting with requirements, starting with user needs, moving to design inputs and requirements and standards and risks, going through a design process, getting to design outputs, achieving a finished medical device, but all along the way, doing verification, doing validation, and doing design reviews along the way. This process is part of what's called design controls, and it's a part of a company's quality management system. Many companies have never heard of a quality management system, of design controls, of verification and validation. Do you see where this difference between a checklist and a process comes in? If you're thinking, I've just got to go out and test these things and send it to FDA and I'm going to get my 510K, the reality is they're expecting those checklist items to emerge from a process that looks like what's on your screen in front of you. It is easier to implement design controls for a face mask than it is for a heart-lung machine. There's a lot more to do when you have a more invasive device that may be life-sustaining or things like that. But nevertheless, that process is part of the expectation. It's what the FDA is expecting. And if you walk in saying, we're going to get this 510K without doing that legwork and dotting those I's and crossing those T's and making things link, you're going to be caught off guard because you thought you were going for a checklist. And in fact, FDA was looking for a process. You, of course, can put these things into a Gantt chart. And it's important to recognize that whatever development activities you're doing, a lot of the quality management system activities need to be happening in parallel. You didn't need a quality management system for your EUA. You're going to need one for your 510K. And that's something that will catch a lot of companies off guard. You didn't need design controls for your EUA. You're going to need them for your 510K and for your ongoing work. So understand that these things can happen in parallel, and they need to happen in parallel for many of these things. So let's go back here to the tale of 3 roadmaps. Remember, only one of these works. The company by default tends to think, I just need to test these things and submit it to FDA because that's what I had to do for my emergency use authorization. If you read the FDA guidance, and I hope you do if you're doing masks or anything else, you're going to get more nuances. You're going to get more information. You may still think, oh, it's a checklist, do these things and I'm fine. But if you understand that behind all of this is an expectation for a quality management system and design controls in most cases, you're going to understand that that is what drives the specifics, and how you execute on those specifics is based on what many have called the local law. FDA expects you as a company to write your local law, ensconcing what it is you need to do as a company to meet your own needs. And out of that emerges the roadmap that you need to follow for your specific product, where it fits into the marketplace and into the development process. And then to follow that process that you have created based on their guidance, based on the regulations, so that you can then demonstrate to the agency that you've met your own requirements. It's not the FDA's requirements. It's really your requirements, some of which are FDA's requirements. And with that, I just wanted to give you that. We do have some questions based on this. I'm going to go first to Matt. Matt, you are live with us here on MedTech Crossroads.
Thanks, Gene. Hey, so I've got a question. Assuming that some of these companies don't have a fully compliant quality management system, but they've done all the testing to get the EUA, they may have collected some real world evidence. What does that look like when the company has to go back and address those quality management system issues? Can they kind of construct a QMS that sort of, for lack of a better term, backfills and sort of is designed to meet whatever testing they did, or do they have to redo the testing? What's that look like?
No, it's always a work in process. The first thing to say there, Matt, and thank you for the question, is that any quality management system, even one that's being well run and started from the beginning, it's always a work in progress. The fallacy on the other side of the road, the ditch on the other side of the road, is to think that you're going to write one for all time and it's going to be perfect and it'll never need to be changed. It's always a work in process to adapt and grow with your company. So yes, there would be backfill in a situation like that. The good news is that for a mask, it's probably not as bad as for some other medical devices that we've seen the backfill that people have to do. But the place where you're going to get caught up are a few different places. So, and sometimes for people who are managing a company, they really need to know what the bottom line is. So where am I going to get caught up if I go at it with thinking about it like a checklist? There's at least two places. One is when FDA comes back in response to your 510K and says, you're missing this, this, and this, or we think that you didn't consider this, this, and this. And you're saying, well, I did those tests, it should all be good. That's a major disjoint point when FDA comes back asking for things that if you had done design controls, you would have known. That's an important place where you could have saved yourself some pain. The next point involves really the whole quality management system. And that'll happen the minute FDA decides to come and audit you, which can happen anytime after you're registered with the agency. We've heard many horror stories how if you live anywhere near an FDA part of the agency that has local auditors, they always like to come right before the holidays because they don't want to have to travel. So it's a convenient to look at local folks. When they come and walk through your door and say, we want to see your quality manual, and we want to see your records, and we want to see how this all relates together, that's the next place where things can really get messy. So yes, there would have to be retroactive work done. If you've got the 510K, then you want to be working to be ready for your first audit. If you don't have the 510K yet, you want to pause and say, have we addressed design controls? Because without that, we're likely to get asked questions during our 510K that are going to catch us off guard. Does that answer your question, Matt?
Yeah, sure does. Thanks. The only other nuance in there is, if you you're looking to write design requirements that you've already met. I'm just kind of curious on how the FDA views that, because you can be rather prescriptive if you already know what your product looks like and what your testing results were. Obviously, your acceptance criteria will meet that if you are backfilling.
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, you're going to have to do what you have to do at the point that you're at and to be honest and transparent about it. And if you do know, there's a whole nother question there about when do you start design controls, and we've talked about that in other sessions. Um, you will write it wherever you are at the moment in time. It's important to recognize that for design change, you're gonna have to adapt. So if you discover something along the way after this is in process, you're gonna have to go back and demonstrate that your process allows you to make updates all the way from requirements down to the next step and down to the next step. So I don't think it's something for folks to be scared of if they are just learning about this for the first time. Um, it's time to get on the wagon and do the work. But yeah, it's nothing to panic about. That's for sure. I appreciate you bringing up the question, Matt. Any other quick questions? Looks like he's on mute. There he is.
Yeah, sorry if that was for me. I thought you were asking the group. No, I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it. We've got a hand raised from Frank Urban from Spartan Innovations.
So, Gene, just asking, whenever a company does go ahead and turn that in and gets the emergency use, how feasible is it for a small company with 2 or 3 people to actually go through and do this diligence, QA, QC, the controls? And when does a company, or when should a small company sit there and say, this is kind of beyond us, we need to get another company to come in and do this? And what does that usually entail?
That's a great question. I think to answer that, Frank, everyone has to understand that FDA looks to what we, at least in the industry, call the manufacturer of record. It has never actually been formally defined that we can find, but it's a common term used in practice. And that is the company that's putting the device to market, right? It's the company that puts their name on it. They're the ones that FDA walks through the door and says, can we see your quality system? And then from there says, okay, well, let's dig into this part. Let's dig into that part. Any small company that's ever been part of this process knows that they can't do it all themselves. There is stuff that they're going to have to delegate. One of the things at Into Being that we really recommend is that when you finally have your design and you're moving towards your clearance and you want to select a manufacturer, part of what you want to interview that manufacturer for is their ability to help you comply with the quality system regulations, at least on the manufacturing side of it. They probably can't help you on the design control side of it, but they could help you on the manufacturing side. So there's always going to be this question of delegation. Have I adequately delegated? If you're the company selling the product, you can't escape from all of it, but it is handleable. You can delegate things like manufacturing procedures. And as long as those are being audited and worked through, you can delegate design controls. Into Being does that sort of thing. But you can break that down into smaller chunks. The main point not to lose sight of is you'll never wash your hands of it. The company that's putting the device to market will always be responsible. They'll be the first door that FDA walks through, and that's what you want to be ready for. Did it answer the question, Frank?
Yep, thank you.
Thank you. Great. Well, that is our presentation on 3 roadmaps to 510K. We wanted to do this because we've been hearing so many folks saying, oh, I just need some help here on checking these boxes. And we're going, wait, people, you're still in an EUA mentality. We've got to get out of that. So if you're talking to anybody who is working on an EUA and thinks they're going to 510K, point them to this video after it's posted. Let them know that there's other things going on here that they're going to need to think about. Help them think through that process and just know that there's more that they're going to have to do so they can be ready when FDA sends that first response to their 510K. Also, while we're on that topic of FDA, I think many of you may be wondering, what's FDA up to? Because of everything that's happened, one of the anecdotes that I think you heard here on MedTech Crossroads back when it was COVID Connect was we had actually had somebody say, FDA told us, can we call you on the weekend? We don't want to bother you, but we're working really hard. Can we call you on the weekend? And of course, the company said yes, and everyone laughed because FDA never says that. And FDA is under a lot of pressure. We may be starting to see some of that pressure coming to bear. I wanted to just point to a couple of anecdotes that we've been hearing, especially on the pre-sub front. And this does seem to be depending on which division inside of the agency you're talking to, but we heard some anecdotes in regulatory forums, like a pre-sub was accepted in November, then closed by FDA 2 weeks later. The message that we basically received was go away for at least 4 months. If you still want to pursue this, submit the same information and try to reopen it. We are hearing some of those anecdotes. So what we would say is, if you're interacting with the agency, please be prepared for delays. They've done a great job of prioritizing high priority things from a national health perspective. We can see some signs of stress there from the perspective of everything else. So when you go, please be sure that you've got your ducks in a row and that you're ready to talk shop there with the agency, because we are starting to see some signs of stress. I know they're doing a great job there too, and they're all humans. That's one thing to recognize when you're working with the agency, is that everybody's a human and everyone is up against their own local challenges. So be kind. Well, with that, we have a big announcement today, and we are glad you are here with us. And that announcement is on this next slide. We are announcing the MedTech Crossroads Pitch Party. This is something that we're going to do in 2021. I almost said 2020 again. It just always happens. Here's the thinking. There are many participants in our ecosystem. We've got healthcare providers, we've got inventors, we've got insurers, we've got investors, we've got developers, manufacturers, business accelerators. I probably missed a few. We've got material suppliers. And whenever we have them on the show, it's always a great conversation. We love talking with these people. You know that one of my favorite questions is, what's your passion? Why are you doing this? Why are you in this space? What drives you? And we get to hear from people all over the ecosystem, and we've been able to put so many cool connections together, and we're so thankful for that opportunity. Let's not forget the startups. It's always been a challenge though, because on MedTech Crossroads, the price of admission is education and connections. And you all have come out in spades and made those happen. When we have somebody on, we hear themes that flow through the conversations. You'll hear something over and over and over again, or you hear something new that you've never heard before, and you're like, wow, that is going in the wallet for another time. It's always a challenge though, because when we get to the startups, we know why the startup is there. We know the startup is there because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get this product or service to the market. And it's a hard process. It's a challenging one, and all of their effort is devoted towards it. Now, we've had many guests on who are part of startups because they're long-standing members of the community, and we can look at them and we can say, okay, you're doing this startup and that's cool, but tell us about you and about how you approach startups and teach us. But what about all the startups who are maybe doing this for the first time? Maybe not the first time, but they're really working hard on this idea. What are we going to do for them? How are we going to incorporate them other than just throwing a bunch of pitches up there? Well, what's wrong with the pitch? Okay, but we got to educate people. How are we going to combine these things? So here's the plan. Starting in February 2021, on the last Friday of the month, we're going to give $1,000 to one startup. If this goes well, we're going to do this the next month and the next month. Here's how the pitches are going to work. One startup per week will pitch leading up to that last Friday of the month. So on the first Friday in February, at the end of the show, we're going to have one startup pitch to us. They're going to get to do a 10-minute pitch right at the end of the show. The next Friday, another startup will pitch. The next Friday, another startup will pitch. And on the last Friday of the month, if there's 4, depends on the number of Fridays in the month as to how many companies are going to be part of this, we're going to have a panel of celebrity judges selected from our community who will select a winner, but maybe more importantly than that, who will educate us on their reactions to each of the startups. The startups will not necessarily be pitching live at that show. It's going to be more about the judges talking to us and reflecting on what they liked, what they didn't like, what they see the challenges as being. And this is how we as a community can engage in dialogue about how we think about the delivery of these startup products and services. The judge's decisions will be final. Into Being will not have a vote on that. We're just footing the bill for that. But we're going to let the judges dole out that $1,000 in February, and then subsequent months if it works out well. We haven't taken sponsors for this. If we do, and if you're interested, you're welcome to contact us. We're not going to take a cent of that. It'll all go straight to the startup. In fact, if you want to sponsor it, your name will go on that month's thing, and you can send the check directly to the startup. So it's going to be a little bit informal in that regard. Other details, we'll try to keep similar stage companies in competition with each other, since it will be month by month by month. And to be eligible, right now, all we know is that we want you to be healthcare and life sciences focused, and not to be engaged in an illegal or questionable product. We're not saying that those are necessarily bad things to be working on, but we are going to focus on things that don't raise any new questions. So that's the harebrained scheme for 2021. Of course, we're going to continue all the normal conversations that we have with investors, with manufacturers, with everybody in the ecosystem. And we found over the course of 2020 that most of those conversations just happen on their own. They're really fun. They're a great way to learn about people's passions and to learn who you can connect with, who I can connect with in the community. We wanted to find a fun way to involve the startups, to allow them to talk about what they're doing, and then to learn, because there's plenty of mentors and investors in the community who can reflect on what those startups are doing, and they can give us a lot of live feedback so that we can enter into that discussion and into that dialogue too. So that's the plan for the MedTech Crossroads Startup Pitch Party for 2021, and we're going to see how it goes. We welcome your thoughts, your questions, your comments. And I think with that, we're going to stop that share, and we'll open it up for questions, comments, and community check-ins, because we would like to hear from you. We did have a comment here that you were hearing around 50%. I do hope we didn't have a problem there, but we'll hear more from you as we go. Q&A. Matt asked, how do startups apply to the pitch party? That's great. We actually are going to establish an email address just for this purpose. If you know somebody today, feel free to point them to info@intobeing.com. They can get to us there and tell us that they would like to apply for the pitch party. But we will have a dedicated email address for that, which, Matt, thank you. We probably should have had that already for this week, so I apologize. More details will be coming out in subsequent weeks. We're getting some kudos in the chat there. Other questions or comments or check-ins? We've got Ken Spencer with a comment here.
Hey, Gene, what a terrific idea. Thank you so much. One question on the judges' composition there. Are they primarily venture capital people, or are they clinicians, or have you chosen them already?
We are still selecting the judge panel, so recommendations are welcome. Our goal is to focus on folks who are going to be more like true decision makers in a downstream context. So we will probably be favoring folks who make investment decisions, or true clinical decisions. So we do need some of that support there as well. So we're happy to have you point folks to us for both those roles. We will be selecting probably about 5 judges for a little bit of redundancy. And their responsibilities will be to review the 3 or possibly 4 pitches per month, and then to spend the better part of an hour with us on one show, talking about what they liked, what they didn't like, and most importantly, offering us that critical decision of who gets the glorious $1,000.
Yeah, one of the reasons I asked that is that we've had several of these kinds of things where we've had to pitch things, and then there was a dearth of clinicians on the panel, right? That this could really be something. And then secondly, if it's just venture capital people on there, they're looking for a chance to be a big market, where many of these products are, they're just going to be smaller things, which are just fine, kind of stuff, right? They're not going to be venture capital backed kind of stuff. So I'm just, a mix of people is pretty important on this.
That's a great comment, Ken. Yeah, and we're still selecting that panel, and we'll be announcing them in the coming weeks. So if you know startups as Matt mentioned, or if you know people that you think should be considered for judges in this, we would love to hear from you because those are still being selected. We are aiming to have the first pitch in the first week of February. So we will look forward to that. I'm going to leave the line open for a minute more here in case anyone has any comments, either on the pitch party that we're going to be starting in February, or on this question of checklists versus processes, or back on the vaccines that we were talking about earlier. And we'll give just a few more seconds for that. I want to tell you that we're looking forward to next week's guest is Walt Young, the legendary investor in our community here, who's been part of many of the local successes. He is joining us, and that's going to be a great session. So don't miss it. Next Friday at 2 p.m., Walt Young on MedTech Crossroads. Until then, welcome to 2021. Glad to be with you. Thanks for being with us today. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.